My name is Morgan. I'm a victim advocate at the Sexual Assault Victims Advocacy Center. We work with a lot of victims of sexual violence and their families in the community. We do a lot of presentations about issues of consent and sexual violence. So that's what we're going to be talking about with you guys today. So we're going to go over 4 different sections. Section 1, we're going to talk about consent. We're going to talk about what is consent, why is it important, how do we practice consent. In section 2, we're going to cover sexual assault. So we're going to look at some statistics on sexual assault. We're going to look at what it is specifically and also kind of address some other types of sexual violence. In section 3, we're going to go over some Georgia laws. We're going to talk about what laws you need to know and also the legal consequences of sexual violence. And then in our last section, we're going to end with talking about effects of sexual assault. So that's where we're going to get into some more specifics about understanding trauma, how it affects the victim, looking at the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma. We're also going to look at understanding more about some short and long-term effects of trauma on a victim. So section 1, consent. In this section, we're going to talk about what consent is. We're going to talk about why it's important, and we're also going to learn how to ensure that you're able to get it when you're encountering interactions. So first of all, what is consent? Consent means asking someone for their permission to do something and also accepting what their answer is, whether that's yes or no. So when someone gives consent, they're agreeing for something to happen, they're giving permission for something to happen. And so consent is a part of everyday, healthy, normal interactions, not just romantic relationships, but even friendships, family relationships. Consent should be a part of multiple interactions that you have. So consent is clear, it's coherent, it's willing, and it's ongoing. So to go a little bit more in depth in that, consent is clear, meaning that it's active. So it's expressed through words or actions that create mutual understanding and permission for what's going on. It's never implied. So just because someone doesn't say no and they say nothing, you can't take that as a yes. So if you don't get a verbal yes, if you haven't had a conversation about whatever interaction is going to take place, then you can't assume that their answer is yes. So silence is not consent. Someone who's unsure, if they say maybe, if they say I don't know, that still doesn't count as consent. You need to make sure that you get a verbal yes. Consent is also coherent. So people who are incapacitated by drugs, by alcohol, if someone is unconscious or asleep, they are not able to give consent. So if they're not able to make rational, reasonable decisions, if they're incapacitated in some way, then they're not able to give consent. And pursuing an interaction with them in those states can lead to legal consequences later. Consent is also willing, so it's never given under pressure. It's not obtained through psychological or emotional manipulation. Consent cannot be obtained through physical violence or threat. So someone in an unbalanced power position with someone less powerful than they are, if there's any kind of power dynamic there, they're not able to give consent if there's any kind of pressure. If a boss maybe was wanting to pursue an intimate relationship with an employee below them, that automatically assumes that the employee is less powerful than they are. They may feel afraid to say no because of some kind of repercussions that are assumed and not stated. If someone is maybe a parental figure, or if someone is in a higher position of power, whether it be through an employer, whether it be through sports coach, perhaps, someone who is in a position of authority over you. So a boss, a coach, mentor, pastor, any of those examples would kind of be an example where someone who's in a position of power can easily possibly manipulate that. So you can't assume consent in those situations just because of a power struggle. And consent is also ongoing. So consent must be granted every single time, every interaction. So just because someone says yes in one instance doesn't mean that it's automatically assumed every further interaction means that they're saying yes. Just because you're dating someone, just because you're married to someone, doesn't mean that consent is guaranteed in every interaction. So it's important to make sure that consent is an ongoing part of the relationship. Another easy way to remember this is to think of it as FRIES as an acronym. So consent is freely given, meaning it's given without coercion, without fear of some kind of consequence. It's reversible, meaning that it can be taken away at any time. So if someone agrees to an interaction and they say, yes, I'm comfortable with this, and then as things progress, they decide they become uncomfortable, they can reverse that and they can say no. So consent is reversible. It's informed, meaning that the individual who's consenting knows what they are consenting to. They're aware of the interaction that's going to take place. It's enthusiastic, meaning that the person is excited and willing and wanting to participate in whatever situation is going on. And it's also specific. Like I said, it's just because someone agrees to a yes for one interaction doesn't mean that that is a yes for further interaction. So consent is specific to whatever situation they are agreeing to in that moment and not necessarily future situations. So why is consent important? There's a lot of reasons. One being respect, that everyone deserves respect, and consent shows respect not just for yourself, but for those that you're interacting with. Another reason it's important is because consent is valuable for everyday social interactions, not just romantic ones, even just friendships. Consent is a foundation for a healthy relationship. And to go further on that, a lot of people have been through different traumas. You may not know when someone has experienced a trauma, so interacting with someone, touching them without their permission could cause trauma that you weren't aware of. And it also protects yourself and the other person involved. So if you don't have consent and something takes place, there are legal consequences that could occur. So consent is really important for all of those reasons. And just to go further on some of those points, respect is defined as thinking of someone with deep admiration and treating them with kindness and dignity. At the very least, even if you don't respect someone, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. And so consent shows that respect, not just for yourself, but for your partner or whoever it is that you're interacting with. Consent is also, like I said, the foundation for a healthy relationship, even with your friendships. You may not know if somebody has experienced something that may be triggering to them. 70% of adults have actually experienced some type of trauma in their life, and trauma affects people in different ways, but one of the most common ways is by triggers. So touching someone without their permission, even if it's a friend, could cause some kind of trigger. It could cause a flashback. It could cause re-traumatization. So it's important that we talk about consent, that we practice it, so that you prevent any of those situations from happening. So some examples of triggers that could take place in everyday interactions. Playing with someone's hair. That could be triggering if somebody has had a previous assault. Maybe they were in a domestic violence situation where someone held their hair back in order to assault them or held their hair back in order to gain control over them. If you come up behind someone and pat them on the back or hug them from behind, that can put them in an uncomfortable and vulnerable situation. It could remind them of a time where they were taken advantage of, somebody got control over them from behind. There's a lot of different examples on how simple, somewhat friendly, seemingly friendly interactions could be really traumatizing to someone. Even touching someone without their consent at all, whether it's on the shoulder, whether you want to go up and give someone a hug without their permission. Again, it could make that person feel like they aren't in control of their body and like they don't have a say in what kind of interactions they're a part of. Practicing consent also protects you as well as others involved just from legal consequences. So just a few characteristics here. You cannot get consent from a minor. The law in Georgia states that any sexual contact with a minor, someone who is under 18, it's considered statutory rape, which is a felony. A felony charge in Georgia, if you're under 21 years old, you can get 1 to 20 years in prison. If over 21 years old, it's a minimum of 10 to 20 years in prison and a mandatory sex offender registration for life. Also, marital rape laws state that any non-consensual intercourse, even with a spouse, is considered rape and is treated as such. So just because they're your wife or your husband or whoever you're married to, that doesn't just assume consent in those situations. So make sure even in relationships, even in marriages, that you're getting consent before sexual interactions or any interactions take place. And so getting this consent ensures that you are not committing a crime when you're engaging in sexual contact. So some ways to make sure that you're practicing consent. The easiest and number one way is just to ask. If you have not asked, then you don't have consent. Don't ever just assume that you have consent, and don't just go off body language. Body language is not reliable. A lot of people communicate in different ways. So what you may take and perceive as someone giving consent through body language may not be at all what they're saying. So it's really important to make sure that you have a active conversation, a verbal conversation about what you are both comfortable with taking place. And again, if they're unconscious, if they're asleep, if they're under the influence, it's an automatic no, and they're not able to give consent. Just to wrap this up, there's a brief video kind of wrapping up some of the things we've talked about regarding consent.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, "But you wanted tea last week." Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
So by now, we're recapping section 1. You should have an understanding about what consent is. You should know a little bit about why consent is important, and hopefully you should have learned some things about how you can receive consent and ensure that you have it in your interactions. So moving on to section 2, we're going to talk about sexual assault. In this section, we're going to gain an understanding of what sexual assault is. We're going to learn about some of the facts and myths surrounding sexual assault. And we're going to also look a little bit about the prevalence and some of the statistics about sexual assault. So beginning, what is sexual assault? Sexual assault occurs when someone is forced or manipulated into unwanted sexual contact. And this occurs without the other person's consent. So now that you have an understanding of what consent is, when you look at sexual assault, you can kind of see anything that does not fit under consent would be considered sexual assault or sexual violence. There are a lot of forms of sexual violence, including sexual assault, but other forms include human trafficking, stalking, rape, teen dating violence, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse. And we'll talk about a little bit more of those later. Now you're gonna watch a video looking at some of the myths and then facts surrounding sexual assault.
Hey y'all, it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and we at Catharsis year-round hear a lot of sexual assault awareness myths, and we wanted to share some actual sexual assault awareness facts. Myth: rape is just sex. Fact: sexual assault is about violence. It's about power and control, and that power and control being taken away from one person. If we buy into this idea that sexual assault is just sex, we're buying into the perpetrator's narrative, not the survivors. Myth: dressing provocatively, behaving provocatively, and drinking a lot means that you're asking for it. Fact: when I go to a bar and ask for a drink, I'm asking for a drink. None of those things are consenting to anything more than just those things. There is no article of clothing that is going to turn someone into a rapist. There are people who are raped wearing any number of different things. Showing off a little skin is nothing more than just showing off some skin. Myth: a lot of people just lie about being raped or file false reports. Fact: it's actually only a small percentage of reports that are found to be false. We have this idea that a lot of people lie about it because we hear about that a lot more. Because people think maybe they just want attention. But stop and think about it. What kind of attention do survivors of sexual assault actually get? And then people think maybe it's just for revenge. Stop and think about it. Have you ever been mad at someone? Okay. Wanted to get revenge on that person? So you accuse them of a felony crime, right? Of course not. We don't do that. Myth: men can't be victims of sexual assault. Fact: 1.5% of all men have been raped. 47% of bisexual men have experienced some form of unwanted sexual contact in their lifetime. I know that we often see more representations of female victimization, but that doesn't mean that men haven't been victimized. Myth: rape takes place in dark alleys, the bushes, or white windowless vans. Fact: the majority of this crime takes place between two people who know each other in a setting that's familiar to one or both of them. The majority of the time, the perpetrator is a friend, a coworker, a classmate, an acquaintance, a partner. This crime can happen in marriages, in long-term relationships, in any gender dynamic, in any sexual orientation. It's about power and control. Myth: if someone didn't fight back during the sexual assault, maybe they wanted it. Fact: no, they didn't. We often think of the fight or flight response to a traumatic experience, but we tend to forget the third F, freeze, otherwise known as tonic immobility. It's just survival mode. Our bodies don't always fight or run away. Sometimes they just want to survive the situation. None is more valid than any other one. It's just what our body does. Myth: being sexually assaulted by someone of the same gender identity makes a person gay or lesbian or bisexual. Fact: no, it don't. The only thing that would make you anything other than what you are right now is you deciding that you're something other than what you are right now. Myth: there is nothing we can do to prevent sexual violence from happening. Fact: oh yes, there is. 1, we make sure that consent is part of every normal sexual encounter that we engage in. Verbal, active, ongoing consent. If we make that the norm, people who don't care about consent are going to stand out. Number 2, support survivors, no matter their gender, no matter their sexual orientation, no matter their race, their class, their religion, whatever. They all are deserving of our support. And number 3, we become upstanders. Instead of standing by and allowing this crime to perpetrate in all of the communities that we're a part of, we do something to prevent it. Whether that be calling it out, whether that be distracting from the situation, or whether that just simply be walking up and saying, I don't like what's going on here. Let's do something to stop it. That's how we can do something to prevent this crime from happening. So go on, do something.
Now we're going to look at some statistics about the prevalence of sexual assault. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 33 men will be a victim of sexual assault in their lifetime. 17.7 million American women have been victims of attempted or completed rape, and 2.78 million men in the US have been victims of sexual assault or rape. One common misconception is that men are not victims of sexual assault or rape, and that's actually not the case. Men very often are victims of sexual assault. They are victims of sexual violence as well, but they don't feel as comfortable being able to come forward with those things. Every 98 seconds, someone in the US is sexually assaulted. There's a lot of people victimized each year. So 80,600 inmates were sexually assaulted or raped in 2014. 60,000 children were victims of substantiated or indicated sexual abuse. 321,500 Americans, 12 and older, were sexually assaulted or raped. And 18,900 experienced unwanted sexual contact in the military. So the myth that sexual assault doesn't occur in our area or in our state or in our region is simply not true. Sexual assault and sexual violence affects every member of the community, whether you're man, woman, LGBTQ population, minorities, military, law enforcement, children, multiple people, inmates, all people have experienced or been a victim of sexual violence. The majority of sexual assaults occur at or near the victim's home. Often I feel like there's a misunderstanding that if sexual assault does happen, it's like what we see in the movies. Someone is kidnapped or taken off somewhere and sexually assaulted. But actually, 55% of sexual assaults occur at or near the victim's home. 15% are in an open or public place. 12% occur at or near a relative's home. 10% are in an enclosed but public area, such as a parking lot or garage, and 8% happen on school property. So by now, you should have an understanding of what sexual assault is. You should be familiar with some of the facts and the myths surrounding sexual violence. And you should also be informed about some of the prevalence of sexual assault in our area and in the world. So for this section 3, we're going to talk about some Georgia laws. So in this section, we're going to learn about the various Georgia laws concerning sexual assault, and we're going to also look at the legal consequences of committing sexual crimes. So Georgia Code 16-5-21 refers to aggravated assault. This is assault with the intent to murder, rape, or to rob with a deadly weapon or any object that results in serious bodily injury. If convicted, this is punishable by imprisonment anywhere from 1 to 20 years. Georgia Code 16-6-1 refers to rape. This is carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will, or carnal knowledge in any form of a female less than 10 years of age. Carnal knowledge in rape occurs when there's any penetration of the female sex organ by the male sex organ. If convicted of rape, punishment includes death, imprisonment for life without parole, or no less than 25 years in prison. Georgia Code 16-6-3 refers to statutory rape. Statutory rape occurs when sexual intercourse occurs with any person under the age of 16 and is not his or her spouse. If convicted of statutory rape, it's punishable by 1 to 20 years if you're under 21, or 10 to 20 years if you're older than 21. Something important to note here is that there is a Romeo and Juliet provision. If a victim is between 14 to 16 and the person convicted is 18 or under and no more than 4 years older than the victim, then they are guilty of a misdemeanor and not a felony. 16-6-4 refers to aggravated child molestation. This occurs when any immoral or indecent act is done to or in the presence of any child under the age of 16 with the intent to arouse or satisfy sexual desires of either the child or the person. Includes by means of electronic device, including the transmitting of images of a person engaging in, inducing, or participating in immoral or indecent acts to a child under 16. If convicted of aggravated child molestation, sentencing is life in prison or no less than 25 years. Georgia Code 16-6-22 refers to incest. Incest occurs when a person engages in sexual intercourse or sodomy with a person whom he or she knows they are related to, either by blood or by marriage. Example, a father, mother, and a child or stepchild, siblings of whole or half blood, grandparent or grandchild, aunt or uncle, niece or nephew. If convicted of incest, this is punishable by imprisonment of 10 to 30 years. If the victim is under 14, then 25 to 50 years in prison. Georgia Code 16-6-22.1 refers to sexual battery. Sexual battery includes the intentional physical contact with the intimate parts. This refers to primary genital area, anus, groin, inner thighs, the breasts of a female, buttocks, of the body of another person without consent. So intentional physical contact with the intimate parts of the body of another person without consent. If convicted of this, it is punishable as a misdemeanor of a high and aggravated nature if the victim is over 16. If convicted of sexual battery against any child under 16, this is a felony punished by 1 to 5 years in prison. 16-6-22.2 is aggravated sexual battery. Aggravated sexual battery occurs when a person intentionally penetrates with a foreign object the sexual organ or anus of another person without consent. If convicted, this is punishable by life in prison or no less than 25 years, followed by probation for life. So how does consent play a role in sexual violence? How does consent play a role in these laws? Ensuring that you have consent will ensure that you're not committing a sexual crime. And also knowing what these crimes are will kind of help you be informed about whether or not the situation you want to engage in is illegal or if it's a crime. So consent, also knowing what the laws are a good way to protect yourself and make sure that you are not harming yourself or anyone else. So to recap Section 3, by now you should have learned about various Georgia laws concerning sexual assault, and you should also have learned about some legal consequences for sexual crimes. In Section 4, we're going to talk about the effects of sexual assault. So in this session, you will understand trauma as it affects victims of sexual assault. We're going to learn a little bit about the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma. And you're also going to learn about some of the short and long-term effects of sexual assault on victims. So trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, and trauma affects anyone and everyone differently. So when experiencing trauma, you may respond in one of three ways. You may fight, your adrenaline gets going and you try to get out of the situation. You may flight, meaning you may want to run or escape in whatever way, or you may freeze, meaning that you just freeze everything you're doing and it's like you're numb and it becomes an out-of-body experience. So a lot of social assumptions about rape, about sexual assault, when people ask questions, well, why didn't you fight? Or why didn't you get away? Why did you just stand there and do nothing? People don't realize that there are various responses to trauma. And so someone may end up freezing in a situation where they feel afraid or they feel scared. And so that may be why it seems like they aren't doing anything to protect themselves, when really that's their body's way to survive. In that moment, their body is saying, in order to get out of this situation, you need to stop what you're doing and freeze. This is why it's really important when we talk about consent that it's something that is ongoing, it's something that's verbal, it's something that you continually throughout the experience are making sure you're getting from your partner. If you see that your partner is frozen, they're not contributing in any way to the experience, it seems like they aren't participating anymore, that would be a good time to stop and communicate and see what's going on. Because that could be their body reacting to trauma. Maybe they feel unsafe, maybe they've began to feel uncomfortable and they don't know how to verbalize that, and so they're frozen. So one reason that consent is really important to understand the full gravity of what consent means is to make sure that in your interactions with your partner, you know that you're keeping them safe. You know that you are not somehow traumatizing them without even realizing it. So make sure that when you're practicing consent, that it is something you're continually getting, you're continually communicating throughout the interaction, that they are involved, that they are excited, that they are wanting to be a part of whatever it is that's taking place. And now we're going to watch a short video about the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma.
Humans, like all species, have self-protective mechanisms to help us survive. Our fight, flight, or freeze survival response, the FFF for short, is designed to mobilize our brain and body to fight an enemy, run from an avalanche, or freeze to hide from a predator. Our brain sometimes misinterprets safe situations as dangerous and can set off false alarms. When the amygdala, our brain's watchdog, senses and barks danger, our body enters survival mode quicker than our rational mind can react, leaving it trying to figure out why we feel in mortal danger. When the FFF alarm is sounded, we start to breathe more quickly and shallow, causing hyperventilation, and our heart starts beating very fast. These changes can cause strong chest pain, which many people interpret as symptoms of a heart attack, when in fact it's just a result of the FFF activation, which can be relieved through breathing exercises. As a way of getting you ready for action, blood is diverted towards the major muscle groups. Blood flows away from our digestive system, causing the bladder to relax, and we might feel the need to pee. The mouth goes dry, nausea can occur, and we get the butterflies feeling in our stomach. Blood also rushes from extremities, leaving us with cold hands, but often sweaty palms as the action-ready body starts sweating to avoid overheating. Legs and hands can start trembling and feel weak, while tension starts building in big muscles like the thighs, neck, and shoulders. In our head, FFF alarms cause our brain to focus on negative memories, probably so it can scan them to avoid danger and negative outcomes. We get tunnel vision as our pupils dilate to increase our focus and long vision, but as a result, we lose our peripheral vision. FFF activation also reduces our ability to recognize differences in facial expressions. Too much oxygen and too little CO2 can result in dizziness or lightheadedness, which many people interpret as signs that they might faint. But because fainting is caused by a drastic drop in blood pressure, and because the FFF increases both our heart rate and blood pressure, it's nearly impossible to faint when this happens. Over time, depression, anxiety, and high levels of stress all harm the brain's ability to slow or cancel false FFF activations, causing them to happen more often. Knowing the symptoms of false activations makes it easier to recognize and reduce their effects. At Tankyboxen, you can learn both bottom-up and top-down techniques to reduce false FFF activation and bring your body back to balance.
Okay, now we're going to talk about some short-term effects for victims of sexual assault or sexual violence. These can include things like guilt, shame, fear, numbness, shock, feelings of isolation, pregnancy, or sexually transmitted infections. All of these can occur either immediately after the assault or even weeks and months later. Trauma, as I said, affects people differently, and so as the person is processing that trauma, they may not immediately experience some of these symptoms. It may seem like they're fine. It may seem like they just want to get away and kind of isolate themselves. And then they may even later on start remembering things that they didn't remember. They may start experiencing physical symptoms of anxiety or stress. They may start feeling ashamed. They may feel guilty or afraid, paranoid. All of these things can occur at different time periods depending on how the victim reacts to trauma. Some other effects of sexual violence: 70% of sexual assault victims experience moderate to severe distress, a larger percentage than for any other violent crime. This can also include things like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, abuse of alcohol, abuse of drugs, and suicidal ideation. All of these things can occur to a victim of sexual assault or sexual violence. Victims of sexual assault are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression. They are 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They're 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So by now, you should have an understanding of trauma and how it affects victims of sexual violence. You should have an understanding of the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma. And you should also have an understanding of some of the short and long-term effects that trauma may have on a victim. So just to review, we've talked about consent, we've talked about sexual assault and sexual violence, We've reviewed some of the laws in Georgia and some of the consequences legally of sexual crimes. And we've also talked a little bit about trauma. So the reason that the things we talked about today are so important and the reason that we're so passionate about them is just because sexual assault affects so many people, and people don't realize that they have support, they have advocates that are here and in the community to help them. So again, I'm a victim advocate. I work at the Sexual Assault Victims Advocacy Center, and what we do is we serve victims and families of sexual violence, whether that assault happened today, right now, or whether it happened 20 years ago. We can still provide you and your family services. Maybe you're a mom and your daughter was assaulted and you need to come and just get some support for that. We can serve you as well. So some of the things we do, we have a 24-hour hotline, so 365 days a year, 24/7, we are available to talk to you, to come in and do an exam if that's something you want to pursue, to make a report. We do criminal justice advocacy. We work directly with law enforcement. We work directly with the district attorney's office to offer you support, to offer you a sense of friendship and advocacy on your behalf when you go and make these reports. You never have to do those things alone. We are there with you throughout the entire process if you choose to report. That's something we can help you with. That's something we can keep you updated with. We'll work with the detectives. We work with local law enforcement to make sure that you're informed and to make sure that you're treated fairly throughout the entire process. So we are advocates on your behalf. We will make sure that you are treated fairly, and we'll make sure that we're there to support you throughout that whole process. We also do 24-hour medical accompaniment, meaning if an assault has taken place and you choose to have a forensic medical exam, we actually have sexual assault nurse examiners that work directly with our center. And so we have a room, a forensic medical exam room at our center. So you'd be able to come to us in the comfort of our center instead of a hospital, and we would be there with you throughout that process. You could do the forensic interview at our center, and we would go through that whole process with you, explaining everything that's going to happen and offering you the support of gathering evidence if you choose to make a report. We also do one-on-one crisis intervention. So if you feel triggered one day, or if something happens and you're in the community and you get a flashback, or you're experiencing PTSD and you need to talk to someone about it, your advocates are available 24/7. You can call us anytime and talk to someone, and we can help you through that process. We also have a trauma-informed counselor that's on our staff that offers free and confidential services to you as long as you need them. And she is there to support you, to encourage you, and to kind of walk through this healing process with you. We also do community outreach, so we do things like this, where we talk to the community and we talk to different people about consent and about sexual assault. We go into a lot of public high schools and middle schools, and we educate kids on how to know when something is not appropriate, how to know what healthy relationships look like, how to be on the lookout for teen dating violence. So that's a big part of what we do as well, is working with different community agencies in order to end sexual assault and prevent it in whatever way possible. So we serve sexual violence, human trafficking, stalking, and teen dating violence victims in Walker, Dade, and Catoosa counties. But just because you aren't in that county doesn't mean that we can't offer you services. It just may mean that we know someone that's closer to you, or will help you figure out another agency that may be more convenient to serve your needs. So at the very least, if we are not able to help in some way, we will absolutely connect you with someone who will. It is really hard to report sexual assault. It's really hard to process this on your own. And so that's why we're here. We're here to help make that process easier for you, to offer you support and encouragement so that the healing journey happens quicker, and that we're there to support you during that journey.